So we're making a change on a job from a heat lamp in the bathroom to an exhaust fan and light fixture. Heat lamp to light. Before, after, before, after. I told my electrician, let's try to use the existing hole for the light and see if we can keep additional sheetrock damage to a minimum. But I'm happy to float and retexture whatever needs to be repaired otherwise. Okay, I guess I better break out the drywall tools and joint compound. And while we're at it, the homeowner changed out his heating and cooling system to one that no longer needs this big air conditioning register in the ceiling. So we'll repair that hole while we're fixing the bathroom ceiling. The steps I use to do this are the same steps you can follow to repair anything from a minor hole where a doorknob hit a wall through something like this. The ceiling framing in the bathroom gives me the wood backing to screw new sheetrock in place with only one additional piece of backing needed. One important thing I've learned about repairing situations like this is to keep the sheetrock at a minimum flat with the old ceiling. I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute, but it's enough to say right now that the flatter the new is compared to the existing ceiling, the better. Prepping the cutout in the hallway is a little more involved. Because there is ductwork that is no longer needed, that's impacting my ability to add new wood backing. Also, one corner of the sheet metal from the ductwork is hanging down a little bit below the existing ceiling. So I'm using a Dremel tool with a cutting disc and scoring the ductwork at least enough to be able to bend it out of the way so it won't interfere with the placement of the new sheetrock. Then I take a couple of 2x2 pieces cut to length and screw them into the ceiling joists that are on either side of the ductwork as backing for my new sheetrock. The goal is to position them so that the new sheetrock will flush out with the existing ceiling. I also add a couple of batts of insulation up in that duct space before screwing in the sheetrock. Probably the most important part of my whole process is to get new drywall tape that I'm putting on these joints a little below the surface of the surrounding mud and texture. I do that by cutting roughly half the width of the drywall tape lightly through the surface of the existing ceiling so that I can remove a layer before adding new tape and mud. With a putty knife or blade, it sometimes comes off real simply like this if you take the blade and run it under the edge. Some places it may not necessarily come off that easily, so I use a little more aggressive approach, like the multi-tool in this case, to cut the paper basically off the surface of the sheetrock. As I get into actually filling and covering the new joints with an initial coat of mud, the first thing I'm concerned about is getting as smooth as possible an initial coat in place. It doesn't have to be pretty, just in place with a piece of drywall tape embedded in it. I sometimes use my blade to cut the tape to length, but honestly it's just as easy to pull the tape off the roll to the length you need and pre-cut it before you ever start applying mud. As I place the tape on the joint, I use the blade to squeeze the mud out from underneath the tape, and that's really important to do. There needs to be enough mud on the joint to do this before you apply your joint tape. You want the tape to pull moisture from the mud. You don't want any dry spots in the tape that will cause a noticeable bubble after it dries. If you end up with an air bubble after the mud dries, the quickest fix is to cut that section of tape out and apply another piece of tape and mud on that spot. It's not a big deal, but you can avoid that from happening during this process by taking care during that step. With tape in place, I'm adding a quick layer of mud over the top of the joint. Adding this layer at this time I really think of as adding a base coat of mud to my patch, which is just a very thin coat of mud that will make my next layer of mud go on much easier. The main thing I don't want to do is to build up anything at this point which can cast shadows. The reason that patches show in the ceilings is because often they are a little too thick, so they begin to cast shadows when compared to surrounding areas. The patch kind of hangs down from the ceiling, and then shadows from the lights or windows are visible from the patch, so it stands out from the rest of the ceiling. The main goal with this initial coat is to be able to have as few lines as possible in the wet mud. It's not a huge concern, but having fewer lines can almost eliminate the need to sand the patch at all before applying the next layer. I'm not concerned about going beyond my tape joint at this time, but if I do, I want to make sure that I feather out the mud as I work. Again, I'm not wanting to create any lines or ridges if possible. With additional coats of mud, I'll use a wider blade that will also make it easier to feather the edge and minimize the possibility of creating shadows in the ceiling. The hallway is a different type of ceiling with a much heavier texture, which is called a heavy knockdown or brocade type ceiling. Using the same process I did in the bathroom for applying mud to these joints, in this case I pre-cut the tape before putting it up for no particular reason apart from it seemed like I needed one more hand to hold a mud pan or tape than I had available. With the same goals as in the bathroom, I'm filling the joints and then adding tape over the top of them, burying the tape in the fresh mud. I made a little mistake, or perhaps I would take a different approach on the outside of this patch if I were doing it again. I'm trying to just float over the top of the tape and not go beyond the width of the repair opening that much. It would have been fine to use a bigger blade in this case and add a coat of mud all the way across to the outside walls to just build up the first layer a little bit more. I ended up creating a little bit of a ridge that I see now but didn't so much at the time when I was doing the work. I don't know that many other people will ever notice because of the overall variety in the ceiling texture application, but I see it and thought I would point it out. I switched from my 6-inch blade and am now using an 8-inch wide blade because I'm going to build up this coat a little heavier on this patch than I normally do on the first coat due to the thickness of the ceiling texture. Again, my interest is to get as smooth a coat as possible, get it as level as I can with the existing ceiling, and try to leave as few lines as I can in the wet mud on this first coat. If I can do all those things, it simply means that I might be able to finish the patch with one more coat of mud before it's ready to texture. If that doesn't work out, that's fine too. It's no big deal to add another coat of mud in between to get the surface ready before texturing. On the bathroom patch, I'm also using the wider 8-inch blade now because it's easier to feather the whole area out just a little bit wider with it. When I look down the length of the blade, I'm checking something very important to be aware of. All these blades are designed with a slight bow in them, which is very helpful in applying the next layer of mud. In this case, I want the bow to be against the ceiling so that the middle of the blade is making contact with the ceiling before the outside corners do. That makes it easier to feather the mud on the outside edges as I pull across the surface of the ceiling. I used the blade to knock off the ridges of the lines I left on my first coat, so rather than sanding and filling the air with dust, I can just knock off the tops of those ridges and float right over them. Because there's a dry coat of mud already on the ceiling, this coat of mud is going to dry much quicker. So by gauging how the mud is reacting as I put it on, if I time it just right in the drying process, I can drag my blade across the new coat of mud again with the bow against the ceiling and basically get no lines on the second coat or very minor lines. You can see a bit of shadow is cast here, but it's really not much at this point. After this coat dries, I'll be able to see if there's any additional work that is needed to finish prepping the ceiling before texture. When I look at the original texture on the ceiling, it almost looks like they may have used a paint roller and watered down mud to create this type of look. Many coats of paint over time have also smoothed it over pretty well too. So I thought about it for a day or two while I was repairing the patch and tried to come up with a way to easily replicate this old texture on the new patch. Back in the hallway now, doing the same thing of knocking off any of the ridges, and again, here's where I would say I probably should have just floated all the way to the corner. But because this is a much heavier texture on the ceiling itself, I wasn't that concerned about it here. But as you can see from the light from the bathroom, I'm already getting a little bit of a shadow cast that had I floated all the way to the corner and flattened that whole area out, that probably would have eliminated that little ridge from showing up here. I'm adding another coat of mud to bring the thickness of the patch to roughly the same level as the rest of the ceiling, so that when I stamp the new texture over the top of this, the whole ceiling will blend in together. One thing I'll point out here as I'm adding and smoothing out the new mud I'm putting over the base coat is beginning to reach a point where I can almost get a completely flat pass over the mud without leaving any lines. So as I work on figuring out a path or direction I can use to pull the blade so that I can cover as much of the surface area as possible with a single pass, since I'm having such good results with the next layer of mud. On to texturing the bathroom ceiling now. I decided to try this real fluffy and inexpensive brush to add some texture on my patch. I'm experimenting at the moment with watered down mud in the bucket that I'm holding. You can use many different approaches to get close to the look of the texture you're trying to match, and with more trial and error you begin to get the feel of it. If I don't like this, I can flatten it out with the blade and try again, but I think this is going to work. By taking a foam brush now, I can smooth over the new texture my bigger brush is leaving and begin to get it to look closer to the old texture. Every once in a while I need to squeeze the buildup of mud off of my foam brush tip to keep the brush functioning the way it needs to. I wish this process was a little faster, but the patch is relatively small, so I'll continue this way. If the patch were a little larger, it would have been better time-wise for me to have skim-coated the entire ceiling in the bathroom from the start and then textured the whole ceiling with a quicker method. So I would never texture an entire ceiling using a method like this. Keep in mind that once the texture dries, I can take a damp sponge and wipe across it to smooth the effect if needed. Painting the ceiling as well will also soften the appearance of the new texture. The application process to the hall ceiling is much different, and in this case I'm using what's called in the construction trades a hawk to stamp mud on the ceiling itself. As I stamp mud on the ceiling, it leaves these little reverse mountain peak looking globs. Then I reload the mud on the hawk and swirl it around again to continue to stamp the pattern on the ceiling. I have no specific plan but to apply random stamps to the area that needs to be textured. Next, I take my blade and drag it across those tops of the peaks to flatten them out, and in so doing, I get this texture to look very similar to what's on the rest of the ceiling. A good thing about this type of ceiling texture is that it's not particularly difficult to do, and if you maintain some sort of pattern to your stamping process, you'll get your pattern replicated throughout an entire ceiling pretty consistently. But even as you look at the old ceiling, you can see that the people that originally applied the texture in the first place have areas that are not heavy on texture and some that are. After the texture is dry and ready for paint, oftentimes it's a good idea to plan, like in the case of the ceiling in the bathroom here, to paint the entire ceiling. That's sometimes the simplest way to finish things off so that you don't have any obvious indications, like paint shade variations, that you patched your ceiling. So I start by cutting in the entire ceiling all the way around at the corners. I rolled a test spot on the patch of the ceiling to see what kind of results I was getting. It wasn't perfect, but was passable. Earlier I did take a damp sponge and wiped it across my new texture just to smooth it out a little bit more. As I mentioned before, as long as you don't overdo it and always err on the side of under texturing, you're more likely to be okay with your patch. If your texture is a little less than what surrounds it, it's much less noticeable than if your texture is too heavy compared to what's around it. Here's a couple of points to remember when painting. Make it a habit to always use drop cloths. If you have an accident, it's much easier to toss a drop cloth than clean paint out of grout joints or carpet. Gauge the amount of paint you pour out from your can to the size of the job you're working on. I like these smaller pans on smaller jobs because you make so much less of a mess if you happen to have a disaster and knock over your paint tray. There are so many types of rollers and paint trays out there nowadays that give you real good results and are easy to work with, so try some of those new products that maybe you haven't tried yet. I can kind of see the edge of my patch right there from the light coming from the bathroom and causing it to cast a little shadow over this spot, which kind of bugs me. But when it's all said and done, if I didn't know there had been a hole there, I would have never noticed this when walking through the house. When I'm shooting this footage, the paint was still drying, so once it's fully dried, the patch will not be visible. Learning these basic steps that I've mentioned in this video really do give you the ability to patch any types of damage in drywall in your home and get good results. There are other ways to apply different types of textures that I don't cover in the video, but here are a couple of links to other videos. One where I spray texture from a hopper, and this replicates the same type of orange peel texture or light knockdown textures that are very common. In your hardware stores, you can find cans of spray texture that give you this kind of effect, so check those out. And remember, there's always something going on around Dob's Workshop, so check in regularly and see what we're up to.